Today I'm going to share with you guys my 18-month update and full review on my contact paper countertops and backsplash. I'm also going to give you guys the full tutorial and answer every single question that I've received over the last year since posting my 6-month update. I will leave a timestamp down in the description box for anybody that would like to skip around the video. I'll also leave the full supply list down there as well. If you're already subscribed, thank you guys so much for continuing to support my channel. If you're new here, consider hitting that subscribe button, ring that bell for notifications so you don't miss any future content on my channel. I installed this contact paper to use as a temporary update until we got to a point where I had the time and money to do a full renovation in this kitchen. And to be honest with you, I never thought that it would be a year and a half later and we're still using the contact paper. It has held up so well that it's kind of given me the opportunity to put off this renovation for even longer. I am currently drawing up plans to completely gut this kitchen and start from scratch, but this countertop has let me put it off. So right now I'm thinking within the next 6 months to a year, we will probably do a full renovation, but I'm not in a huge hurry because the countertops look fantastic. That being said, it is still contact paper, so there is some wear and tear after a full year and a half. For the most part, the countertop edges look great, but this section right here to the left of the stove is the first section I installed when I did this a year and a half ago, and I didn't have a great method on that first piece, so it looks a little wonky, but the rest of it, I had a pretty solid method that I'll show you here in a little bit that gave me really tight, straight lines. So that first corner doesn't look so great, but it's not a big deal, and it hasn't gotten any worse over the last year and a half. And if you look closely here at that edge of the countertop that runs across the front of the stove, you can see how good it's held up over time, except for a couple of little nicks in the contact paper, which I'm sure are just from banging pots and pans or whatever around that area while we're cooking. Again, it's not a big deal, and I don't notice it unless I'm really up close in front of it, and they don't seem to get worse over time. They don't peel away from the original countertop, so it hasn't been an issue. Now moving to the right from the stove area is this main stretch of countertop space between the stove and the sink. I do most of my prep work when I'm cooking on this little area right next to where that fruit stand is, and it doesn't look any more visibly worn than the rest of the countertop, so it's held up pretty well. And moving on, this is actually the worst area in my kitchen right now. This is something that just really started to be visible very recently in the last month or so, but I just so happened to have my coffee pot placed right on top of this seam where two of the pieces of contact paper overlap. And this probably wouldn't be an issue, but every single night when I set up my coffee pot for the next morning, I grab the coffee pot and I pull it forward towards me and add my coffee and my water and set the timer and everything. And then I push the coffee pot back up against the wall. Then sometimes if we happen to make a second pot of coffee during the day, I do it again. I pull the coffee pot forward, I push it back. And I did not realize that rubbing constantly every day for a year and a half across that seam of the contact paper was rubbing it down and has finally created this spot where it's just rubbed through the seam. I could easily replace this section of contact paper, and I will show you how to do that. But at this point, I'm not too worried about it. I'm planning on renovating within the next year anyways, so I'm just gonna deal with it for now. But I will show you how to easily replace a piece if you need to. Next, I wanted to show you guys the area around my kitchen sink. This area has held up particularly well considering how much water it gets. We're a family of 7 people living in this house, and we do a lot of dishes. The kids are in here, they make a mess, they splash water everywhere. There are a lot of times where there might be water sitting on the countertop for a while until I happen to walk by and clean it up. And I've literally not had any issue whatsoever with water getting underneath the contact paper. It hasn't peeled up at all. There's no bubbles. I haven't had any issues, absolutely zero. The last area I wanted to show you guys before jumping into the tutorial is the breakfast bar area, because this area gets the least amount of traffic and I don't really use this at all for food prep or anything really. It's held up really well. It's gotten the least amount of wear and tear out of the entire kitchen. There's this one yellow stain and I can't figure out where it came from or what caused it, but it's the only stain on the entire breakfast bar, and I'm just going to continue cleaning it and hoping that it fades over time. If it doesn't, it's not very noticeable, so still not a very big deal. Let's go over the supply list really quick, and everything you see here will be linked down in the description box as well. The most important thing that you need is the contact paper itself. I've used a couple different brands on a few different projects, and this DC Fix brand is by far my favorite. I also used a handheld stapler, an X-Acto knife with several extra blades. You will need to swap them out throughout the process, a pair of scissors, a spatula or putty knife, and silicone in whatever color matches the contact paper best that you are using. Since I used a white marble contact paper, I decided to go with a clear silicone, but you could also use white instead. And you'll also need a caulking gun for your silicone. When you're installing contact paper around the kitchen sink, you always want to start by removing the silicone. One of the great things about contact paper countertops is that you can easily replace a section if you need to down the road. So when I did my 6-month update, that's exactly what I did. I replaced some sections of countertop so that I could show you guys an extremely detailed tutorial on exactly how to get the perfect countertops. Once you've got all of the silicone removed, I use a vinegar water solution, but you can use really any countertop cleaner and just thoroughly clean that area underneath where the silicone was. Again, it doesn't matter if you're just replacing the silicone, if you're replacing a single section of contact paper, or if you're doing this on your original countertop for the first time. You always want to clean the surface really well. So for this part of the tutorial, I removed the section of contact paper that's directly to the left-hand side of the sink. So luckily, when I installed this contact paper, this particular piece does not have another piece overlapping it from either side. So all I had to do was pull it up from underneath the ledge of the countertop, and it just simply peeled right off. But if you have a piece of contact paper that you ever need to replace and it has contact paper overlapping it on one of the sides, I will show you shortly how to deal with that. A great thing about this contact paper is that it doesn't leave any residue or any trace of itself behind. But just to be on the safe side, I went ahead and cleaned this countertop surface thoroughly before installing a new piece. You want to make sure that the countertop is thoroughly cleaned underneath, so you're not trapping anything gross underneath the contact paper, and also you don't want like a random bump of something to show through the contact paper because it wasn't cleaned off properly. I also like to make sure that the countertop is thoroughly dried before installing the contact paper. I know that some people use a Windex hack, but I personally am just not thrilled by the idea of moisture being trapped underneath the contact paper. Now you want to take your roll of contact paper and lay it out over the area that you're going to be covering. I typically like to start with it facing upright so I can make sure that the pattern looks like it will match up okay. And then once I know the piece will look good where I'm putting it, I flip it over and I use the grid on the back to determine exactly what length to cut it at. You want to make sure that you leave it slightly longer than you need it to be so that you can easily secure it to the underside of the countertop when you're done. When you install the contact paper on either side of the sink, you want to make sure that it's lined up with the back edge of the countertop, and you also want to leave some of that contact paper hanging over the side of the sink itself. I would say that I probably left about 1.5 to 2 inches of the contact paper laying over the side of the sink. And you also want to install the contact paper to where it overlaps the back edge of the countertop ever so slightly. So here, once I have an idea of where I need it to go, I peel up the first few inches of backing on that contact paper and very carefully line it up with the back edge of the countertop. Then I line it up, leaving about 1/4 inch of that contact paper overlapping the back corner, and I use my fingers to press it down and secure it along that back edge of the countertop. Then I take one hand and reach underneath to grab a hold of that release paper. Then with my other hand, I go with my spatula and start smoothing the contact paper out, working my way from that back edge of the countertop towards the front. You want to make sure that you work slow and steady from this point. So start with those first few inches and work out all of the air. Make sure you're smoothing out the entire surface. Once you feel like you have those first few inches pretty well secured, then pull that release paper from underneath, giving yourself a couple more inches at a time to work on smoothing out. Then if you have any issues and there's a bubble that's not smoothing out with the spatula, just lift that section up with your hand and then go back and smooth it out again. And you'll just repeat these steps all the way until you get to the edge of the countertop. Once you've smoothed out the surface of the countertop, you want to take your spatula and smooth the contact paper out into the edge of the sink. This helps you be able to see the outline of the sink itself. Then take your X-Acto knife and start trimming away at the excess contact paper. Make sure that you're not trimming off too much of the contact paper yet. You want to leave at least some contact paper still overlapping the entire side of the kitchen sink. Then take your spatula again and start pushing the contact paper up underneath the ledge of the sink. Once you have the contact paper where it's kind of folded and pushed underneath that ledge, you can take your X-Acto knife and hold it at an angle just pointed right underneath that ledge and slowly cut away all of the contact paper that's still hanging out over the side of it. If you have countertop edge strips, the method is pretty much the same for that as it is around the sink. I just take my spatula and I use that to push the contact paper underneath the bottom edge of that edge strip. And then I take my X-Acto knife and place it at an angle wedged between the two and use that to cut away the excess contact paper. And if you don't have edge strips, then you can just use your X-Acto knife to cut it up against that back corner, and you can secure that back corner with silicone or caulking. Next, before I finish sealing around the sink, I want to get the edge of the countertop secured in place. To do this, I want to pull that contact paper down as tight as I can around that corner on the edge of the countertop. So I start by just pulling it by hand, and then I take my spatula and press firmly, pulling in a downward motion, securing it as tightly as I can around that edge. Once I'm satisfied with the way it looks, I take my staple gun and I add a staple every few inches along that underside of the countertop edge so that I can make sure it doesn't peel up down the road. The last thing that you want to do when you're installing contact paper around the edge of a sink is to reseal the edge of the sink itself. I like to run a bead of silicone all the way down the edge of the sink, and then I take my finger and use my finger to smooth it all the way out. The main goal here is just to completely cover that crack and make sure that no water gets down underneath there. I wanted to replace this section of contact paper across the front of my stove. This section has contact paper overlapping it on the left and the right hand side. So to keep from having to pull both of those sections up just to replace this one section, I used my X-Acto knife and I cut a slit just scoring the top of the contact paper and pulled it right off. You can easily do this at any point in time if you have a section of contact paper that you want to replace, but you don't want to have to peel up the sections to the left or the right of it, and you just want to get rid of one little area that has a stain or a scuff mark. Installing contact paper around a built-in cooktop like what I have is pretty much an identical process to working around the kitchen sink. I had removed the silicone before I removed that section across the front of the stove, so at this point I'm just thoroughly cleaning the sides of the contact paper around the stove and the front edge of the original countertop before I move on and install the new contact paper and replace that silicone. Measuring your contact paper in front of the stove or the kitchen sink, you just want to do the same as before and make sure that you leave a little bit of overhang around the edge of the stove or the sink and leave enough to wrap underneath the front edge of the countertop as well. Then again, you want to make sure that you cut this to the right length and that it's not too short. When you're working with a section as small as this one, just go ahead and peel the backing off of that entire sheet of contact paper. Hold it carefully, making sure that it doesn't fold over on itself, and then line up the contact paper with the edge of the stove. Just like before, you want to make sure there's a little bit of overlap on the edge of the stove, and then use your finger to secure it down in place on the countertop. Then use your putty knife and push the contact paper up into that edge or that lip around the side of the stove. Still using the spatula, smooth the contact paper down over the countertop surface. Once you have that front edge completely smoothed down onto the countertop surface, wrap it tightly around the edge of the counter. Then you'll fold it underneath and secure it with a stapler just like we did before. And again, I'm doing this just the same way as I did around the sink, and I'm using my X-Acto knife to trim off the excess contact paper that's hanging over the lip of the stove. One more little trick that I want to show you guys. Whenever I first installed the contact paper on the left and the right hand side of this stove, I didn't know to overlap the side of it like I know to do now. So you can see whenever I'm trimming off this excess contact paper around the rounded corner of this stove, there's a little gap where the contact paper is missing. To cover that gap, I just took a little strip of contact paper and I trimmed it down to size to fit right over that hole. Then after pressing it down in place, I went back with my spatula and just smoothed it out and made sure it was nice and stuck down to the other contact paper. After that, the only thing left to do is to reseal the stove just like we did earlier around the sink with new silicone. When installing contact paper to my breakfast bar, I had to figure out how to tackle both of the rounded corners that are at the one end of the counter. So to do this, I needed to again start off by measuring out my contact paper. I needed to make sure that the contact paper was long enough that I could wrap it under both ends of the countertop, as well as wrap it around the very end or the edge of the island as well. Once I had the contact paper cut to size, I laid it down figuring out exactly where I needed it to lay. I'm going to be working from the inside out, so I can't risk the end of the countertop not having enough length to wrap around underneath the edge. Once I was confident with the positioning of the contact paper, I started to peel up the first couple of inches of contact paper backing towards the inside edge of that breakfast bar. Again, you want to be really careful when you do this and don't let the contact paper flip over and stick to itself. Once I had that first couple inches of contact paper exposed, I carefully lined it up right where I wanted it to go and used my fingers to stick down that very edge of the paper to the countertop. Then I took my spatula and I started to carefully and slowly smooth out the contact paper. You want to work from the middle and then towards the outside edges. And if you see any bubbles, lift that section of contact paper and work those bubbles out before you release any more of the contact paper and keep working further down. Once I had the top of the breakfast bar smoothed out, I went around and did the side edge on all three sides of the breakfast bar, but staying away from the corners. And I didn't staple the contact paper underneath yet. I mainly just wanted to get it secured in place on all three sides. When I got to that third side and had smoothed out the contact paper over the edge of the counter until I got to the point where I could tell the curve in the counter started, then that's where I started with my first method of wrapping the corner. So here, right where I can tell the contact paper's no longer laying flush against the edge of that countertop, I took my X-Acto knife and starting right at the edge of the countertop down, I cut a slit in the paper. And then about a half of an inch over from there, I cut one more slit into the paper. And that is what divides the rounded corner from the flat surface. So now I can go ahead and make sure that that countertop edge is completely smoothed down and I can secure it underneath with a staple. Also, just to point this out here, I'm sure you can tell the contact paper does not look like it's sticking very well to the countertop, and that's because there's a very large section of laminate that is just missing from this part of the counter. So I just had to kind of fake it till I made it with this part, and where the laminate is missing, the staples underneath the countertop is pretty much what's holding it in place. Now that I have the side to the left of the corner secured, I can take that first slit that I cut and wrap that tightly around the curve of the countertop and secure it underneath with a staple. Then you just repeat that process every 1/2 inch, cutting a slit in the contact paper, working from the edge of the counter down, and then securing it underneath the edge of the corner with a staple. And you can tell here that the first couple of strips that I wrapped around the corner did not lay perfectly smooth and flush, and that's because of the missing laminate strip underneath. But here by the third strip, I'm working on a surface that is covered in laminate, and it lays perfectly flush and smooth over that rounded corner. So if you have perfectly intact laminate, then you should get good results. But if you're missing chunks of laminate, you can still do this. You just have to kind of work with what you've got. As you get closer to the end of the rounded corner, you can start pulling down on that contact paper to see if there's still a curve that you're working with, or if you're done wrapping the curve yet. And if you get any type of wrinkle or wave in the contact paper, if it won't lay flush, then just keep cutting 1/2 inch slits and wrapping it around until you've got a surface that will start to lay completely flat to the surface underneath it. Once I was done with that corner, I did add a few staples to the contact paper to the left of it just to secure it in place, but we have one more corner to wrap, so I didn't take it all the way down to the edge. Then I just repeated those steps and wrapped the second rounded corner, and when I was done with that, I went ahead and finished securing the contact paper on the flat edge of the countertop. And just to point out one more flawed area for you guys, on this other rounded corner, although I was missing less laminate on this corner, it was a smoother surface to work with. There were a couple of chips of countertop missing from the bottom of the edge of the counter, so even though it laid pretty flat, you can see these little kind of chunks missing along the bottom. For my second method in wrapping rounded corners in contact paper, I'm going to be taking basically just a long, narrow strip of contact paper. You just want to make sure that it's a little bit wider than the width of the edge of the countertop itself. Separate the contact paper completely from the backing. Then place the contact paper strip right over the corner of the countertop and just wrap it around and smooth it out over the surface with your hand. Any of the contact paper that sticks up over the top of the edge of the counter, carefully trim off with your X-Acto knife. Be very careful not to gouge the contact paper that's underneath. And you'll wrap the contact paper underneath the edge of the corner the same way you did the first method, just by cutting slits in the contact paper and then wrapping it underneath and securing it with a staple. I've done this 2 different ways, and the first time I wrapped it horizontally around the corner first and then wrapped the strips vertical around the edge of the corner, and then this time I'm doing it the way I showed you, where I wrapped the strips around first vertically and then took the horizontal piece and covered that. I would say that both methods work really well, and you could do just one or the other, but I tend to prefer the way I did it this time because that horizontal strip is just one continuous piece and it looks a lot more seamless this way. But I also like the way the vertical strips that come over the edge tie in the countertop surface area, and these 2 methods together just give you a more finished look. I hope I answered all of your questions, and I feel like I covered everything, but If there's anything I missed or you have any questions that I did not cover in this video, please feel free to leave it down in the comment section. I answer every comment I ever get. And also just a reminder, if you're looking for any of the supplies that I used in this video, everything will be linked down in the description box. If you guys are already subscribed, again, thank you so much for your continued support. It means the world to me. And if you're new here, think about hitting that subscribe button, ring that bell for notifications so you don't miss any future content on my channel. Don't forget to check out one of these videos linked above, and I will see you guys next time.